let me mention a couple other matches of importance to St. Louis racquetball at the 73 Nationals and how Jerry Halischer and Kenny Wong did in that event. First, for just some bad luck, Jerry Halischer drew Steve Keeley in the round of 16. And Jerry and Kenny Wong, excellent players, but Jerry, who drew Steve Keeley, and Kenny Wong, who drew Steve Strandemo, both Strandemo and Jerry Halischer were looked at as guys that could potentially move into the top four. They were the two superstars, future superstars. But unfortunately for Jerry Halischer, he drew the great Steve Keeley in the round of 16 and fought him hard, incredibly hard, taking him to a tiebreaker and losing 21-16 in the third game. But I've always felt, had he had a different draw, his result would have been different. And then came Kenny Wong, who was matched up against Steve Strandemo. And Wong was a great, great player, highly intelligent player, not to mention that he was a PhD in computer science from MIT, had something to do with his intelligence of racquetball, but he was a great, great competitor and fought a Steve Strandemo, who was the favorite, the obvious favorite against Kenny Wong. But Kenny Wong reached down and fought him. Tough first game, 21-17, won the second game by the same score to eliminate Steve Strandemo, which was a huge victory for St. Louis racquetball, that we were very well represented in the quarterfinals. And then you probably wonder if I played in that tournament, and I did. And you probably wonder what the result was. Which you think I won? You were wrong. Because I ran up against a guy from Florida, and normal like this, being a historian of Florida racquetball players, Frank Johnson, a good player from Florida, took me out in, I'll say a tough three-gamer because it went 3 games, but I think Frank was a much, much better player and stuff than I was at the time, and knocked me out of the tournament. But one little footnote, I would get my revenge on Frank Johnson a little bit later on. But moving on about the 73 was the discovery of women's professional racquetball and some real hidden gems that showed up. Jan Campbell was the young favorite to coming into that event. Jan Pasternak was the reigning national champion. And then Fran Cohen from St. Louis was a top 4 player prospect in racquetball. But the one thing I remember about women's racquetball is you knew about the top 1 or 2, 3 players, but could anybody else come through the 73 Nationals because the draw was, I believe, at least a round of 32 with women from all over the country. And in 73 was the discovery of a future Hall of Famer, and in my opinion, the greatest female racquetball player ever, in Peggy Steding from Texas. And when she showed up and drew Jan Campbell in the first round, a total unknown, it was one of the greatest matches in the history of, I would say, in racquetball, not just in women's racquetball, because of the matchup, contrasting styles. Jan Campbell played a very pattern-like game, a game that she was coached at the time from Charlie Brumfield in San Diego, and an extremely polished player. I remember her strokes, her fluidity was second to none out there. And all of a sudden, she was on a court with somebody who was a hard hitter and came in, I remember, practicing drive serves, hard drive serves, at a level of how the men drew hit drive serves at the time, which was kind of like a stunner. But it still didn't seem like to anyone that her game was good enough to beat a Jan Campbell. Then became the big matchup in the first round with Peggy Steding against Jan Campbell, who was a big favorite to win the event. But Peggy Steding brought a whole different mindset and game to women's racquetball that women at that stage hadn't seen before. Not only did she have an extremely powerful drive serve to the likes of many of the men on the tour at the time, but she also had an overhead that at the time men just felt like women could not hit the overhead shots, which were shots that only some of the most skilled men can hit, and Peggy Steding had that a part of her game.
16, serving 19.
Okay, good serve. Shannon takes it up to the ceiling.
There's an overhead there.
Playing a little tentative right here. Ooh, there's a break for Peggy.
But in saying everything that Peggy Steding had, nobody still believed that she possessed an overall game to beat Jan Campbell. But boy, did we see a match for the ages. As that match began, the drive, serving, and physical aspect of Peggy Steding was incredible to behold, and how great at the time, the most skilled woman player, Jan Campbell, was able to actually deal with it and actually combat it, to fight tooth and nail the first game all the way down to the end to win a 21-20 first game victory over Peggy Steding. And I remember how amazed everybody was with the level of play of the women, and how that all of a sudden this lady from nowhere, basically from Texas, came in and was playing an extremely aggressive game, a physical game that nobody had ever seen, was giving Jan Campbell all she wanted in the first round. And the second game, I believe, was more of the same way, close, tight, the whole way. Every match, every rally was a sheer battle. And getting back to my earlier reflection of how the game was played, the rallies were long and hard and an incredible level that nobody had seen women play. And so as the second game got tighter and closer, and both scores never reached beyond a couple of point differential, they were 20-all in the second game, and they came in and out at least 3 or 4 times, I remember, with Jan Campbell having a number of opportunities to win that match. But Peggy Steding persevered, won that match, which just seemed to break the will of Jan Campbell, because she had been on the court for over 2 hours battling with a woman that came up with just some incredibly hard, difficult shots that she didn't know exactly how to judge, how to play, and it wore her down. And when the third game rolled around, it was all Peggy Steding, who won a very, very convincing third game, like 21-8. And the defeat was the talk, I remember, of the tournament as to who was this gal and where did she come from, and what was this game style about, as she continued to just motor and run through the draw, the ladies' draw. It was an incredible coming out period for Peggy Steding, who played Jan Pasternak, who was the defending champion, in the finals, in a match that was closely contested, around 21-17, 21-18 in both games. But Peggy Steding was clearly there to not only to define a new level of women's racquetball, but actually to show that women's racquetball can be played at a level never seen before. And Peggy Steding went on to have an incredible career, a Hall of Fame career, and was one of the nicest, most generous individuals I ever met along the path of my career in racquetball, and one of the greatest representation for women's racquetball.